The frigid Montana winter of 1876 showed no mercy as Cordelia Mackenzie crashed through the thin ice of Silver Creek Lake, the freezing water instantly stealing her breath and sending shockwaves of pain through her entire body. Cordelia had only arrived in Pine Valley, Montana, 3 days earlier, another stop in her seemingly endless journey westward. The 22-year-old had left Boston behind after her father's unexpected death 6 months prior, along with the suffocating expectations of a society that viewed her as nothing more than a possession to be married off to the highest bidder. Her inheritance had provided her with enough money to travel west, seeking the independence that had always called to her spirit. The heavy wool skirts that had seemed so practical against the biting winter air now dragged her downward like anchors as she thrashed in the icy water. Her lungs burned for air, and her fingernails scraped helplessly against the slick ice surrounding the hole she'd fallen through. Each desperate attempt to pull herself up ended with another piece of ice breaking off, widening the deadly trap. "Help!" She managed to cry out once, her voice thin and barely audible even to her own ears. The vast emptiness of the Montana wilderness swallowed her plea. No one would hear her. No one would come. She was utterly alone. Cordelia felt the fight beginning to leave her body as the cold seeped into her bones. Her movements grew sluggish, her thoughts hazy. Perhaps it wouldn't be so terrible to surrender to the peaceful numbness that was gradually replacing the pain. Just as her eyes began to close, a thunderous crack echoed across the lake, followed by the pounding of hooves. Through water-blurred vision, she saw a figure dismounting from a horse at the lake's edge. The tall silhouette moved with purposeful strides directly toward her, seemingly unconcerned about the treacherous ice. "Hold on," a deep voice commanded. "Don't you give up." Quentin Irwin had been tracking a wounded elk when he heard the distant cry. 28 years in the unforgiving wilderness had honed his senses to detect even the faintest sounds of distress. He'd abandoned his hunt without hesitation, urging his stallion renegade toward the lake. Now, as he carefully distributed his weight across the ice, inching toward the struggling woman, he realized just how dire the situation was. Her lips had turned blue, and her movements were growing weaker by the second. There was no time for caution. Quentin took a deep breath, shed his heavy coat and gun belt, and moved more decisively toward the hole. "I'm coming for you," he called out, his voice carrying across the ice. "Keep your eyes open." The ice groaned beneath his weight as he spread himself flat, crawling the final few feet to the edge of the broken section. Cordelia's eyes fluttered open at the sound of his voice, a flicker of hope momentarily brightening their emerald depths. Without hesitation, Quentin plunged his arms into the freezing water, gritting his teeth against the immediate shock of cold. His hands found her shoulders, then slid down to grip her beneath her arms. With a powerful heave, he began pulling her from the water's grasp. "I've got you," he grunted, muscles straining against her waterlogged weight. "Help me if you can. Push with your legs." Cordelia summoned what little strength remained, kicking weakly against the water as he pulled. Inch by agonizing inch, she emerged from the lake. When her torso cleared the hole, Quentin dragged them both backward across the ice, not stopping until they reached solid ground. He wasted no time wrapping her in his discarded coat, lifting her into his arms as if she weighed nothing at all. Her teeth chattered violently and her entire body trembled. "My CC cabin," he said, his own breath forming clouds in the freezing air. "Not far. Got to get you warm." Quentin whistled sharply and Renegade trotted over. With practiced ease, he mounted while still holding Cordelia against his chest. He could feel her heartbeat, rapid and weak, through his damp shirt. She needed warmth, and quickly. Stay with me, he urged, spurring Renegade into a gallop. What's your name? C. Cordelia, she managed through chattering teeth. Cordelia, he repeated. I'm Quentin Irwin. You're going to be all right now. The dense pine forest flew past in a blur as Renegade carried them along a narrow trail. True to Quentin's word, it wasn't long before a small log cabin came into view, smoke curling from its stone chimney. He'd never been more grateful for having stoked the fire before leaving that morning. Dismounting with Cordelia still in his arms, Quentin kicked open the cabin door and headed straight for the fireplace. He gently set her down on the bearskin rug in front of the crackling flames. These wet clothes need to come off, he said matter-of-factly. You'll catch your death otherwise. Cordelia nodded weakly, her fingers too numb to work the buttons of her dress. Without hesitation, Quentin retrieved a hunting knife from his belt and began carefully cutting away the sodden fabric. There was nothing improper in his gaze or touch, only the urgent efficiency of a man determined to save a life. Once he'd removed her outer garments, he wrapped her in several thick wool blankets, then moved to a trunk in the corner. He returned with a flannel shirt and a pair of worn trousers. They'll be too big, but they're dry, he said, turning his back to give her privacy. Can you manage, or do you need help? I'll manage, Cordelia whispered, her voice gaining a little strength from the warmth of the fire. Her fingers fumbled with the clothing, but she eventually succeeded in pulling on the borrowed garments, which indeed swallowed her slender frame. Done, she said softly. Quentin turned back and nodded with approval. He moved to the small kitchen area, filling a kettle with water and placing it on the cook stove. Hot tea with plenty of sugar, he explained. Best thing for the cold shock. As he worked, Cordelia took in her surroundings. The cabin was small but neat, with every item having a clear purpose. Dried herbs hung from the ceiling beams, and several handmade wooden furniture pieces spoke of skilled craftsmanship. A bookshelf held an unexpected number of volumes, ranging from practical guides to what appeared to be poetry and novels. You live alone? She asked, her teeth finally ceasing their chattering. Quentin nodded. 7 years now. Find I prefer the quiet. He brought over a steaming mug and handed it to her. Careful, it's hot. Cordelia wrapped her hands around the mug, savoring the warmth that seeped into her fingers. The sweet tea slid down her throat, spreading heat through her core. Thank you, she said, looking up at him properly for the first time. You saved my life. Quentin Irwin was not what she had expected. Tall and broad-shouldered, yes, with the strength evident in his frame that had pulled her from the lake. But his face held a gentleness that contradicted his rugged appearance. Deep blue eyes studied her with concern beneath a shock of dark brown hair that fell across his forehead. A neatly trimmed beard framed a mouth that seemed more accustomed to seriousness than smiles. What were you doing out on that lake? He asked, settling onto a wooden chair across from her. I was trying to cross to the other side, Cordelia admitted. I'm staying at the boarding house in town, and Mrs. Holloway mentioned a beautiful view of the mountains from the other shore. I thought the lake was completely frozen. It usually is by now, Quentin said with a frown. We've had an unusual winter. Some areas are thick enough to hold a wagon, others thin as paper. You're lucky I was nearby. I don't know how to thank you properly, Cordelia said. No thanks needed, he replied, rising to check on something simmering in a pot on the stove. Anyone would have done the same. No, she said quietly. Not anyone would have risked their life for a stranger. Quentin stirred the pot, his back to her. You should eat something, venison stew. It'll help restore your strength. As he ladled the rich stew into a bowl, Cordelia noticed his hands were still red and chapped from the icy water. He had yet to change his own damp clothing, putting her comfort before his own. You're shivering, she observed. You should change too." A flicker of surprise crossed his face, as if he'd forgotten his own discomfort. "Suppose you're right," he conceded, setting the bowl beside her before disappearing behind a curtain that separated the cabin's living area from what she presumed was his sleeping quarters. He emerged moments later in dry clothing, running a hand through his damp hair. "Storm's coming," he noted, glancing toward the single window where snow had begun to fall more heavily. "You'll need to stay here tonight. I'll take you back to town tomorrow when it's safe." Cordelia felt a flutter of nervousness at the thought of spending the night in a stranger's cabin, but it was quickly replaced by the rational understanding that she had no alternative. This man had already saved her life at considerable risk to his own. If he'd meant her harm, he'd had ample opportunity. "I appreciate your hospitality," she said formally, falling back on the manners that had been instilled in her since childhood. A ghost of a smile touched Quentin's lips. "No need for fancy words out here, Miss Mackenzie." "Just plain speaking will do, Cordelia," she corrected him. "Please call me Cordelia," he nodded. "Cordelia, then." As the afternoon transitioned into evening, the snow continued to fall, accumulating rapidly outside the cabin window. The wind howled around the eaves, but inside the cabin remained warm and snug. Quentin proved to be a surprisingly good cook, and after the hearty stew, color returned to Cordelia's cheeks. "Where are you from?" Quentin asked as they sat before the fire, the worst of the day's crisis behind them. "Your accent isn't local, Boston," she replied. "I've been traveling west for the past few months." "Long way from home," he observed. "Family?" Cordelia stared into the flames. "None left. My mother died when I was 12. My father passed 6 months ago. I'm sorry," he said simply. "Thank you." She looked up at him. "What about you? Any family?" Quentin's expression darkened momentarily. "Parents died in a cholera outbreak when I was 16. Had a brother, younger by 2 years, lost him at Shiloh. The Civil War." Cordelia nodded, understanding. So many families had been torn apart by that terrible conflict, ended just over a decade ago. "So we're both alone in the world," she said softly. "Seems that way," he agreed. Then, as if uncomfortable with the personal turn of the conversation, he stood. "You should take the bed." "I'll sleep out here." "I couldn't possibly," Cordelia began. "You nearly drowned today," Quentin interrupted firmly. "You need proper rest. I've slept on harder ground than this bearskin rug plenty of times." His tone brooked no argument, so Cordelia simply nodded her thanks. The day's events had indeed exhausted her, and now that she was warm and fed, fatigue was quickly overtaking her. Quentin showed her to the small bedroom behind the curtain. A hand-built wooden bed frame held a straw mattress covered with several blankets and furs. A small table with a lantern stood beside it, and a chest at the foot presumably held his clothing and personal items. "Sleep well," he said, turning to leave her in privacy. "Quentin," she called softly. When he paused and looked back, she continued, "Thank you for everything." He nodded once, his expression unreadable, and disappeared behind the curtain. Cordelia sank onto the bed, bone-weary yet strangely alert. The events of the day replayed in her mind the terrifying moments beneath the ice, the strength of Quentin's arms as he pulled her to safety, the quiet competence with which he attended to her needs afterward. In Boston, she had been courted by well-dressed gentlemen with soft hands and rehearsed compliments. None of them had ever made her feel as safe as this rough-hewn frontiersman had in the space of a single afternoon. It was a disconcerting realization. Eventually, exhaustion overcame her racing thoughts, and she drifted into a deep, dreamless sleep. Morning brought a transformed world. Cordelia awoke to sunlight streaming through the small window, reflecting blindingly off the fresh snow outside. For a moment, she was disoriented. until the memories of the previous day flooded back. She rose, still wearing Quentin's oversized clothing, and pushed aside the curtain. The main room was empty, the fire freshly stoked. A pot of coffee sat on the stove, and beside it, a plate with cornbread and honey. The cabin door opened, admitting a blast of cold air, and Quentin, his arms laden with firewood. He stomped the snow from his boots before noticing her. "You're up," he observed. "Sleep all right?" "Better than I expected," she admitted. "Is that coffee I smell?" A slight smile touched his lips. "Help yourself. Figured you might be hungry too." Cordelia poured a cup of the strong black coffee and took a piece of the cornbread. "Have you been outside long? The snow looks deep." "Since dawn," he replied, stacking the wood neatly beside the fireplace. "Needed to check on Renegade and the other animals. Your clothes are dry, by the way. Hung them near the stove last night." She noticed her dress and undergarments folded neatly on a chair, looking remarkably recovered from their icy ordeal. "Thank you. I'll change after breakfast." They ate in companionable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the occasional howl of the wind outside. When they'd finished, Quentin cleared the dishes while Cordelia retreated behind the curtain to change back into her own clothing. Her dress, though dry, bore the evidence of her near drowning. Several tears showed where Quentin had cut it away, and she did her best to pin these closed. Her appearance was far from proper, but it would have to do when she emerged. Quentin was by the window, gazing out at the snow-covered landscape. He turned at her approach, and for a brief moment, something flashed in his eyes, something that made Cordelia's heart skip a curious beat. "The storm's past," he said, all business once more. "But the snow's deep. We'll take Renegade to get you back to town. Your belongings at the boarding house," Cordelia nodded. "Yes, but I don't want to impose further on your kindness." "No imposition," he replied. "Need to go to town for supplies anyway." Within the hour, they were mounted on Renegade, Cordelia seated in front of Quentin, his arms around her as he held the reins. The powerful horse picked his way carefully through the deep snow, following a trail known only to him and his master. Cordelia was acutely aware of Quentin's solid presence behind her, his chest against her back, his breath occasionally warming her ear when he leaned forward to guide Renegade around an obstacle. The impropriety of their position was not lost on her, but out here in the wilderness, the social rules of Boston seemed as distant as the city itself. "How long have you lived in this area?" she asked, seeking conversation to distract herself from their proximity. 7 years, he replied. "Came west after the war. Tried my hand at a few things: cattle driving, mining, even worked as a deputy marshal for a spell. None of it fit right. Then I found this valley, built the cabin, and knew I'd found home." "It's beautiful country," Cordelia acknowledged, taking in the snow-covered pines and distant mountains. "Though somewhat more hazardous than I anticipated." She felt rather than heard his soft chuckle. "Nature demands respect out here, but she rewards those who learn her ways. And have you?" "Learned her ways, still learning," he admitted. "Every day." The journey to Pine Valley took the better part of 2 hours. The small settlement came into view, smoke rising from chimneys, horses and wagons navigating the single main street. Compared to Boston, it was barely more than a cluster of buildings, but to Cordelia, it represented civilization after her wilderness adventure. Quentin guided Renegade directly to Mrs. Holloway's boarding house, a 2-story wooden structure with lace curtains visible in the windows. He dismounted first, then reached up to help Cordelia down, his hands strong at her waist. Her feet had barely touched the ground when the front door of the boarding house flew open. "Cordelia Mackenzie, Mrs." Holloway exclaimed, hurrying down the steps as quickly as her substantial frame would allow. We've been worried sick. When you didn't return by supper, Mr. Holloway and some of the men were planning a search party for this morning. I'm terribly sorry to have caused such concern, Cordelia said. I had an accident at the lake, but fortunately, Mr. Irwin was nearby. Mrs. Holloway's eyes widened as she took in Cordelia's disheveled appearance and the tall frontiersman beside her. An accident. Goodness gracious, child, are you hurt? She fell through the ice, Quentin explained. Got her to my cabin just in time. Storm made it impossible to return until now. Mrs. Holloway's hand flew to her mouth. Through the ice, my stars. I should never have mentioned that view to you, dear. I didn't think you'd try to cross the lake in winter. She turned to Quentin, grasping his hand between both of hers. Bless you, Mr. Irwin. If you hadn't been there. Quentin shifted uncomfortably under her effusive gratitude, just happened to be in the right place. Well, you come in right now, both of you, Mrs. Holloway insisted. I've got fresh coffee and biscuits and you can tell me all about it. Actually, madam, Quentin said, taking a step back, I've got errands to run in town, supplies to gather before heading back. Cordelia felt an unexpected pang of disappointment. Will you at least join us for supper tonight? As a small token of my gratitude. Something flickered in Quentin's eyes, hesitation perhaps, or something deeper. Don't normally take meals in town, he said slowly. Please, Cordelia pressed. It would mean a great deal to me. After a moment's consideration, he nodded. All right, supper. Wonderful, Mrs. Holloway beamed. 6 o'clock sharp, Mr. Irwin, and don't you worry about dressing fancy, we're simple folk here. With a tip of his hat to both women, Quentin mounted Renegade and rode toward the general store at the end of the street. Cordelia watched him go, a curious mixture of emotions swirling within her. Well, my dear, Mrs. Holloway said, looping her arm through Cordelia's, you've had quite the adventure. And may I say, Quentin Irwin is about the last person I'd expect to be playing the hero. Man barely speaks 3 words together when he comes to town, which is rarely enough. He was very kind, Cordelia said defensively. He saved my life. Mrs. Holloway patted her arm. No doubt, just surprised is all. Been here 4 years myself, and that man's a mystery to most folks. Keeps to himself, does odd jobs, hunting and trapping mostly. Some say he was some kind of soldier or lawman before settling here, but he never speaks of it. As they entered the boarding house, Cordelia found herself intrigued by this description. The Quentin she had briefly known seemed reserved but not unfriendly, a man of few words, certainly, but those he spoke carried weight. After a hot bath and change of clothes, Cordelia spent the afternoon resting in her room, recording the previous day's events in her journal. What had begun as a terrifying brush with death had transformed into something unexpected, a glimpse into a way of life so different from everything she had known. When 6 o'clock approached, she found herself taking unusual care with her appearance. She chose her emerald green dress, the color that best complemented her auburn hair and eyes. A simple gold locket, her mother's, was her only jewelry. She pinned her hair in a less severe style than usual, allowing a few curls to frame her face. Mrs. Holloway raised an eyebrow when Cordelia descended the stairs. My, don't you look lovely this evening, she commented with a knowing smile that made Cordelia blush. I merely wish to look presentable, Cordelia replied, smoothing her skirts unnecessarily. Of course, dear Mrs. Holloway said, clearly unconvinced. Oh, that must be him now. A knock sounded at the front door. Mrs. Holloway hurried to answer it, revealing Quentin on the porch. He had made an effort with his appearance as well, Cordelia noted. His hair was neatly combed, his beard trimmed. He wore a clean white shirt under a dark wool coat, and though his clothes were simple, they suited his tall frame well. Mr. Irwin. Right on time, Mrs. Holloway greeted him. Come in, come in. Everyone's gathering in the dining room. Quentin stepped inside, removing his hat. His eyes found Cordelia immediately, and for a moment he seemed at a loss for words. Good evening, she said, breaking the silence. Evening, he replied, his deep voice soft. You look recovered. A small smile curved Cordelia's lips. Yes, thank you. No worse for wear, thanks to your timely intervention. Mrs. Holloway ushered them into the dining room, where several other boarders were already seated around a large oak table. Introductions were made, with Cordelia noticing the curious glances directed at Quentin. Clearly, his presence at the boarding house was unusual enough to cause a stir. Dinner was a lively affair, with Mrs. Holloway's excellent cooking and Mr. Holloway's animated stories keeping conversation flowing. Cordelia found herself seated beside Quentin, who remained quiet but attentive throughout the meal. Whenever the conversation turned to the incident at the lake, he deflected praise with uncomfortable shrugs, redirecting attention away from his role in her rescue. So, Miss Mackenzie, Mr. Holloway said as they enjoyed apple pie for dessert, you mentioned you're continuing west. Still planning to leave us at the end of the week, Cordelia hesitated. When she'd arrived in Pine Valley, she had indeed planned it as just another brief stop on her journey. But now, I'm reconsidering my timeline, she said carefully. Pine Valley has a certain charm I hadn't anticipated. She felt Quentin shift slightly beside her but didn't dare look his way. Well, you're welcome to stay as long as you like, Mrs. Holloway declared. We don't get many cultured young ladies from the East passing through. It's a pleasure having you. As the evening drew to a close, Cordelia found herself on the front porch with Quentin, the two of them momentarily alone as the other guests returned to their rooms, and the Holloways cleared the table. Thank you for coming tonight, she said, drawing her shawl tighter against the cold night air. Food was good, he replied, gazing out at the moonlit street. Cordelia smiled. Yes, Mrs. Holloway is an excellent cook, though I found your venison stew equally satisfying. A hint of a smile touched his lips. Bachelor cooking, nothing fancy. Sometimes the simplest things are best, she offered. After a moment's hesitation, she added, I meant what I said at dinner. I'm considering staying in Pine Valley longer than I'd planned. Quentin turned to face her fully. Why? The directness of the question caught her off guard. I suppose I'm not certain where I'm going anymore, she admitted. When I left Boston, I just knew I needed to get away, find somewhere I could breathe, build a different kind of life. And you think you might find that here? His blue eyes studied her intently. Perhaps, she said softly. I won't know unless I stay long enough to find out. Something shifted in his expression, a softening, a hint of what might have been hope quickly concealed. Well, it's a decent enough town, good people mostly. Would you? Cordelia gathered her courage. Would you show me more of the area? The safe parts, I mean. I'd like to learn about this place, but clearly I need a guide who knows the land. Quentin was quiet for so long that Cordelia feared she had overstepped. When he finally spoke, his voice was low. I could do that. Got traps to check day after tomorrow. Could show you some of the valley on the way back. Cordelia's heart quickened. I would like that very much. The sound of Mrs. Holloway's approaching footsteps ended their private conversation. Quentin donned his hat, nodding to both women. Thank you for supper, madam, he said. Miss Mackenzie, I'll call for you around noon, day after tomorrow, if that suits. Perfectly, Cordelia replied, ignoring Mrs. Holloway's raised eyebrows. With a tip of his hat, Quentin descended the porch steps and disappeared into the night. Mrs. Holloway turned to Cordelia with an expression of amused surprise. Well, she said. I do believe that's the most social interaction Quentin Irwin has engaged in since arriving in Pine Valley. You've made quite an impression, my dear. Cordelia felt her cheeks warm. He's merely being kind after my ordeal. Mrs. Holloway chuckled. If you say so. Though I've never known him to offer guided tours before, not even when the mayor's daughter batted her eyelashes at him for an entire summer. 2 days later, precisely at noon, Quentin arrived at the boarding house. Cordelia was waiting, dressed in her most practical attire, a sturdy blue wool dress with a higher hem than fashion dictated, showing off the new boots she'd purchased from the general store the previous day. You look. Quentin paused, searching for the right word. Prepared, Cordelia smiled. I consulted with Mr. Peterson at the store about appropriate attire for wilderness excursions. I've no desire to be a burden on our outing. Quentin nodded approvingly. Good thinking. He gestured to a second horse beside Renegade. Borrowed Molly here from the livery. She's gentle, good on mountain trails. Cordelia approached the mare, a pretty chestnut with a white blaze down her nose. She offered her hand, and the horse snuffled it curiously before allowing Cordelia to stroke her neck. She's lovely, Cordelia said. It's been some time since I've ridden, though. Molly will take care of you, Quentin assured her. Ready. With his help, Cordelia mounted the mare, arranging her skirts as modestly as possible. Quentin swung effortlessly onto Renegade's back, and they set off at an easy pace, heading out of town toward the mountains. The day was clear and cold, the snow glistening in the winter sunlight. As they rode, Quentin pointed out landmarks and shared bits of knowledge about the land, which peaks had the best views, which valleys offered shelter from storms, which streams ran year-round. Cordelia drank in the information along with the spectacular scenery. The Boston she knew was all man-made elegance, carefully manicured parks, architectural splendor, streets laid out in orderly patterns. This wild landscape operated by different rules, with a savage beauty that both awed and humbled her. They stopped midday in a sheltered grove of pines for a simple meal. Quentin had packed jerky, hard cheese, and apples. Sitting on a fallen log, they ate in companionable silence, watching a pair of eagles circling high above. "Why did you come west?" Quentin asked suddenly, breaking the silence. Cordelia considered the question. "After my father died, there was nothing keeping me in Boston. I was expected to marry. Of course, there were several suitable gentlemen my father had approved of before his death, but the thought of that life—" She shook her head. It felt like a cage. "So you ran." "I prefer to think of it as choosing a different path," Cordelia corrected with a small smile. "My father left me financially independent. I decided to use that freedom to see some of the country before settling anywhere." Quentin nodded slowly. "Brave choice." "Not many women would travel alone." "Perhaps not brave so much as desperate," she admitted. The alternative seemed unbearable. They continued their journey, with Quentin stopping occasionally to check his traps. Most were empty, but 2 held rabbits, which he quickly and humanely dispatched before storing them in his saddlebags. "Your winter stew?" Cordelia asked, impressed by his efficiency. "This and trading," he confirmed. "Pelts for supplies I can't make or hunt. Simple living." As the afternoon lengthened, they turned back toward town, taking a different route that skirted the edge of Silver Creek Lake, the site of Cordelia's near drowning. She felt a shiver run through her at the sight of the frozen expanse, still beautiful despite the danger it had presented. "Scared?" Quentin asked, noticing her reaction. "A bit," she admitted, "though it's difficult to reconcile such beauty with such danger." "That's the West for you," he said quietly. "Beautiful and deadly at once. You learn to respect both aspects." Cordelia studied his profile as he gazed across the lake. There was a story there, she sensed, perhaps many stories, etched in the lines around his eyes and the set of his jaw. "Will you tell me sometime?" she asked. "About the war, about what brought you here?" Quentin's eyes met hers, surprise evident in their blue depths. "Not much to tell that's worth hearing." "I disagree," Cordelia said simply. "I think there's a great deal worth knowing about you, Quentin Irwin." Something shifted in his expression, a momentary vulnerability quickly masked. "Maybe someday," he said, turning renegade back toward the trail. "When there's time." By the time they returned to the boarding house, the sun was setting, painting the western sky in dramatic hues of orange and pink. Quentin helped Cordelia dismount, his hands lingering perhaps a moment longer than necessary at her waist. "Thank you for today," she said, reluctant for their time together to end. "I enjoyed seeing the valley through your eyes." "Wasn't much of a tour," he demurred. "Barely scratched the surface." "Then perhaps we could do it again," Cordelia suggested, heart quickening at her own boldness. Quentin studied her face as if searching for something. Whatever he saw seemed to satisfy him. "Sunday," he said. "Weather permitting. There's a place north of here, old native hunting grounds, sacred spot with a view that'll take your breath." Cordelia smiled warmly. "I'd like that very much." As Quentin rode away, leading Molly behind him, Cordelia stood on the porch watching until he disappeared from sight. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she didn't notice Mrs. Holloway joining her until the older woman spoke. "He's a good man, you know," Mrs. Holloway said softly. "Keeps to himself." But when the Miller's farm caught fire last spring, Quentin was first on the scene, worked through the night to save what could be saved. When typhoid swept through town 2 summers ago, he hunted extra game to feed those too sick to provide for themselves. Cordelia turned to her, surprised by this insight. "He doesn't strike me as someone who seeks recognition for such deeds." "Oh, he'd be mortified to know I told you," Mrs. Holloway chuckled. "Just thought you should know there's more to him than the quiet frontiersman act. Man's got a good heart, just wrapped in a few layers of caution." Over the next few weeks, Cordelia found herself settling into life in Pine Valley with surprising ease. She extended her stay at the boarding house indefinitely and began volunteering at the small school 3 afternoons a week, helping the overworked teacher, Miss Bedford, with reading lessons. Her Sundays, however, belonged to Quentin. True to his word, he took her to the sacred hunting grounds that first Sunday, a breathtaking plateau overlooking the entire valley. Each week after that brought a new destination, a hidden waterfall, frozen into a spectacular ice sculpture in winter's grip, an abandoned mining camp with stories of boom and bust, a secluded meadow where deer gathered at dawn and dusk. With each outing, the reserve between them diminished. Quentin began to share pieces of his past, his childhood on a small farm in Pennsylvania, his reluctant enlistment in the Union Army, the horrors he'd witnessed at Shiloh where his brother fell. He spoke of his aimless wandering after the war, the nightmares that still occasionally plagued him, and the peace he'd finally found in the Montana wilderness. In turn, Cordelia opened up about her own life, her sheltered upbringing, her mother's early death, her father's well-intentioned but suffocating protectiveness, and her desperate need to discover who she might be beyond the confines of Boston society. It was during their 5th Sunday excursion, as they rested beside a frozen stream, that something shifted between them. Quentin had been describing the area in spring, when wildflowers carpeted the banks. "I'd like to see that," Cordelia said without thinking. "The wildflowers, I mean." The words hung in the crisp air between them, laden with implication. If she were to see the spring flowers, it meant staying in Pine Valley for months longer, perhaps indefinitely. Quentin's eyes met hers, intense and questioning. "Would you?" Cordelia held his gaze steadily. "Yes, I would." Neither spoke for a long moment, the significance of the exchange settling around them like the soft snow that had begun to fall. "Cordelia," Quentin began, his voice rougher than usual. "I'm not a man of many words or fancy ones. But these past weeks, the crack of a rifle shot shattered the moment, echoing through the trees. Quentin was on his feet instantly, positioning himself between Cordelia and the direction of the sound. "Stay here," he commanded, drawing his own revolver. "Get behind that boulder." "What is it?" Cordelia whispered, heart racing as she followed his instructions. "Probably hunters," he said, though his tense posture suggested he wasn't certain. "Wait here." Quentin moved silently through the trees, disappearing from sight. The minutes stretched unbearably as Cordelia waited, straining to hear any sound over the pounding of her heart. When Quentin finally reappeared, his expression was grim. "Poachers," he said tersely. "Shot an elk out of season, tracking it wounded. Is that common?" Cordelia asked, relieved it wasn't something more sinister. "Happens," he acknowledged. "But these men, I recognize them. Trouble from over in Bitterroot Valley. Been causing problems around here for months." As if to confirm his assessment, coarse laughter echoed through the trees, followed by slurred voices drawing closer. Quentin's jaw tightened. "They're drunk and heading this way." He turned to Cordelia, his expression apologetic but determined. "We need to leave. Now, quietly." They retrieved their horses, leading them carefully through the trees until they were a safe distance away before mounting. Quentin set a quick pace back toward town, his vigilant gaze constantly scanning their surroundings. "I'm sorry about this," he said when they'd put several miles between themselves and the poachers. "Shouldn't have brought you out this far today." "You couldn't have known," Cordelia assured him. "Besides, I'm perfectly fine, no harm done." Quentin shook his head. "Could have turned ugly. Those men, they're not the kind to mind their manners around a lady." The protective concern in his voice warmed Cordelia despite the chill in the air. "Then I'm fortunate to have such a capable escort," she said with a small smile. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, the intensity of his gaze took her breath away. But whatever he might have said remained unspoken as they continued their journey back to Pine Valley. At the boarding house, Quentin helped her dismount as usual. Before he could step back, Cordelia laid a hand on his arm. "What were you going to say?" she asked softly. "By the stream before we were interrupted." Quentin's expression flickered with surprise, then something deeper. "Nothing that can't wait for a better time," he said finally. Disappointment washed over her, but Cordelia nodded her understanding. "Another Sunday, then." "Another Sunday," he agreed, something like a promise in his voice, but the following Sunday brought a vicious snowstorm that made travel impossible. The next week, Cordelia came down with a mild fever that confined her to bed. The interruptions felt like fate conspiring against them, and as January gave way to February, Cordelia began to wonder if the moment by the stream had been lost forever. Then came the night of Pine Valley's Founders' Day celebration. Despite being a relatively young settlement, the town had established the tradition of a winter social gathering to break the monotony of the long, cold season. The town hall was decorated with pine boughs and lanterns. Tables groaned under the weight of potluck dishes, and a small group of musicians provided lively tunes for dancing. Cordelia had been helping organize the event with Mrs. Holloway and several other town women. When the evening arrived, she wore her best dress, a deep burgundy gown with delicate lace trim that she'd saved from her Boston wardrobe. Her hair was arranged in an elegant updo with a few curls framing her face. As guests began arriving, Cordelia found herself watching the door, uncertain if Quentin would attend such a social gathering. They hadn't spoken since their interrupted outing 2 weeks prior, and she felt his absence like a physical ache. "He'll come, Mrs. Holloway said confidently, appearing beside her with 2 cups of punch. "I sent Mr. Holloway out to his cabin personally with an invitation, made it clear his presence was specifically requested." Cordelia accepted the punch with a grateful smile, though she didn't ask who had done the requesting. Mrs. Holloway's knowing look was answer enough. The evening progressed pleasantly. Cordelia danced with Mr. Holloway, the young schoolteacher Mr. Reynolds, and several other townsmen. She laughed at the mayor's jokes, complimented Mrs. Peterson's apple pie, and helped serve punch to the elderly residents seated along the wall. But her eyes continued to drift to the door. Just as she had begun to accept that he wouldn't come, the door opened, admitting a gust of cold air and Quentin Irwin. He stood uncertainly in the entrance, looking decidedly uncomfortable in what appeared to be his Sunday best, a dark suit that fit his broad shoulders perfectly, though it had clearly been worn seldom. Cordelia's heart leapt at the sight of him. Their eyes met across the crowded room, and for a moment everyone else seemed to fade away. Then Mrs. Holloway was bustling toward him, taking his hat and coat, pushing a cup of punch into his hand, and steering him firmly into the room. Several minutes passed before Quentin managed to make his way to Cordelia's side, having been waylaid by various townspeople clearly surprised by his presence. "You came," Cordelia said softly when he finally reached her. "Got an invitation that was hard to refuse," he replied, the ghost of a smile touching his lips. His eyes took in her appearance, lingering appreciatively. "You look beautiful." The simple compliment, delivered in his straightforward manner, affected Cordelia more deeply than all the flowery poetry her Boston suitors had ever recited. "Thank you," she said, feeling a blush rise to her cheeks. "You look very handsome yourself." The music changed, shifting to a slower waltz. Quentin glanced toward the dance floor, then back to Cordelia. Taking a deep breath, he set down his punch cup and extended his hand. "Would you do me the honor?" he asked formally, as if he'd rehearsed the words. Surprise and delight flooded through her. "You dance, Mr. Irwin, poorly," he admitted with a self-deprecating smile. "But I reckon I can manage not to step on your toes too often." Cordelia placed her hand in his. "I'd be delighted." He led her to the dance floor, placing one hand properly at her waist while holding her other hand in his. As the music swelled, they began to move together. Despite his modest disclaimer, Quentin proved to be a competent dancer, guiding her with the same quiet confidence he showed in the wilderness. "Where did you learn to waltz?" Cordelia asked, genuinely curious. "I wouldn't have thought there were many dancing opportunities in the Montana backcountry." "My mother," he replied, surprising her. "Before the farm, she was a teacher in Philadelphia, said every gentleman should know how to dance, even if he rarely had cause to." "She was right," Cordelia said with a warm smile, "though I'm curious what finally gave you cause." Quentin's blue eyes held hers, suddenly serious. "You," he said simply. "You gave me cause, Cordelia." The directness of his answer stole her breath. Before she could formulate a response, the music ended, and they were surrounded once again by chattering townspeople. For the remainder of the evening they were rarely alone together, yet Cordelia was constantly aware of Quentin's presence, his eyes finding hers across the room, a silent communication passing between them. As the celebration wound down, Quentin appeared at her side. "May I walk you back to the boarding house?" The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the black sky above. They walked slowly, neither seeming eager to end the evening. When they reached the boarding house porch, Cordelia turned to face him. "I'm glad you came tonight," she said softly. "Wasn't so bad," he admitted. "Food was good, company better." Cordelia smiled at the compliment. Much better than our last outing interrupted by poachers. About that day, Quentin said, his expression turning serious. What I was trying to say before we were interrupted. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. Cordelia waited, heart hammering in her chest. I've lived alone a long time, he continued finally. Thought I preferred it that way. Then you fell through that ice and somehow you broke through more than just the lake that day. Cordelia's breath caught at the raw honesty in his voice. I'm not a wealthy man, Quentin said. Don't have much beyond the cabin and what I can hunt or trade for. But what I do have, he stopped, frustrated by his own limitations with words. Taking courage from the emotion in his eyes, Cordelia stepped closer. What you have is worth more to me than all the wealth in Boston, she said quietly. You have honor and kindness and strength. You have a heart that sees the beauty in solitude but isn't afraid to offer shelter to someone else. Quentin's hand rose to gently touch her cheek. Don't know what a refined lady like you sees in a rough man like me, he murmured. But if you're willing to give me a chance to figure it out. More than willing, Cordelia whispered. The kiss, when it came, was gentle yet firm like the man himself. Cordelia felt it down to her toes, a warmth spreading through her despite the winter chill. When they finally parted, both were breathing a little faster. I should go, Quentin said reluctantly. Before Mrs. Holloway comes looking for you with a shotgun, Cordelia laughed softly. She's actually quite fond of you, you know. Is she now? He raised an eyebrow skeptically. Well, still best not to test her patience. Sunday, our usual time. Sunday, Cordelia confirmed with a smile. As winter gradually released its grip on Pine Valley, Cordelia and Quentin's relationship deepened. Their Sunday outings continued, now openly acknowledged as courtship. Quentin began joining the Holloways for dinner several times a week, and Cordelia occasionally spent afternoons at his cabin, always with the propriety of leaving before dusk. By early April, the first spring wildflowers were beginning to appear, just as Quentin had described. On a particularly mild Sunday, he took Cordelia to the stream where they'd been interrupted months before. Now, instead of ice, the water flowed freely, and the banks were dotted with tiny purple and yellow blooms. You were right, Cordelia said, delighting in the transformation. It's beautiful. Worth staying for? Quentin asked, his tone casual but his eyes watchful. Cordelia turned to him with a warm smile. Absolutely worth staying for, though I must admit it's not the flowers that convinced me. He returned her smile, reaching for her hand. They sat together on a fallen log, listening to the gurgling stream and the birds singing in the newly leafed trees. I've been thinking, Quentin said after a companionable silence. Cabin's small, but it could be expanded. Added a proper bedroom, maybe a sitting room. Might even put in glass windows instead of just the oiled paper. Cordelia's heart quickened. That sounds like quite an undertaking. Worth it, though, he said, turning to face her fully, if it means making a proper home for a family. The implication hung in the air between them, clear as the spring sky above. Quentin, Cordelia began, her voice soft with emotion. Are you asking me to marry me? He finished firmly. Yes, I am. No, it hasn't been that long, and I'm not the kind of man you probably imagined ending up with. But I love you, Cordelia Mackenzie. Love you in a way I never thought possible for me. Joy bubbled up inside her like the stream beside them. Yes, she said simply. Yes, I will marry you. The smile that transformed his usually serious face was like the sun breaking through clouds. He gathered her in his arms, kissing her with a passion that left her breathless. When they parted, he reached into his pocket and withdrew a small wooden box. Wasn't sure if you'd say yes, he admitted, but hoped enough to get this when I was in Billings last week. Inside the box lay a ring, a simple gold band set with a small but perfect sapphire. Reminded me of your eyes that first day, Quentin explained, when you looked up at me from that ice. Cordelia's eyes filled with tears as he slipped the ring onto her finger. It's perfect, she whispered. Everything is perfect. News of their engagement spread quickly through Pine Valley. Mrs. Holloway immediately appointed herself wedding coordinator, insisting that the ceremony be held in the town hall rather than the small church, to accommodate all who would want to attend. You may think you're just a solitary trapper, she told Quentin when he expressed surprise at the anticipated guest list. But you've helped just about every family in this valley one way or another over the years. They'll want to celebrate with you. The wedding was set for early June, giving them time to prepare the cabin and for Cordelia's friend from Boston, Eliza Parker, to make the journey west for the ceremony. Eliza was the only person from Cordelia's former life who had supported her decision to travel west, maintaining their correspondence faithfully despite the distance. As the wedding day approached, Quentin worked tirelessly on the cabin, with help from several townsmen who volunteered their skills. By the first week of June, the once small dwelling had nearly doubled in size, with a proper bedroom, expanded kitchen, and sitting area with real glass windows that Quentin had carefully transported from Billings. The morning of the wedding dawned clear and warm, with wildflowers in full bloom across the valley. In her room at the boarding house, Cordelia prepared with Eliza's help, donning a simple but elegant ivory dress that Mrs. Peterson, the town's seamstress, had created for the occasion. You look absolutely radiant, Eliza declared, adjusting the wreath of wildflowers in Cordelia's hair. And I must say, having met your Quentin, I thoroughly approve. He may be a man of few words, but the way he looks at you says everything necessary. Cordelia smiled, her happiness too great for words. 6 months ago, she had been fighting for her life in the frozen lake, certain her journey would end there. Now, she was about to begin a new journey with the man who had saved her in more ways than one. The town hall had been transformed with pine boughs, ribbons, and wildflowers. It seemed every resident of Pine Valley had turned out for the occasion, along with people from neighboring settlements who knew Quentin through trade or his occasional work as a guide. When Cordelia entered on Mr. Holloway's arm, serving as a stand-in for her late father, the assembled crowd rose to their feet. But Cordelia saw only Quentin, standing tall and handsome at the front, his blue eyes fixed on her with such love that she nearly stumbled with the force of it. The ceremony was simple but heartfelt. They exchanged vows written in their own words, promises to cherish, protect, and stand beside one another through whatever life might bring. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, Quentin's kiss was tender yet possessive, drawing good-natured cheers from the crowd. The celebration afterward lasted well into the evening, with feasting, dancing, and more than a few emotional toasts to the unlikely couple, the refined Boston lady and the solitary frontiersman who had found in each other exactly what they hadn't known they were seeking. As night fell, they departed amid a shower of flower petals and well wishes, riding together on Renegade back to their cabin, their home. Quentin had insisted that Cordelia not see the finished interior until their wedding night, wanting to surprise her with the completed renovations. When they arrived, he lifted her from the saddle and carried her across the threshold in the traditional manner, setting her down gently in the center of the main room. Cordelia gasped in delight. The cabin was transformed, not just with the structural additions but with thoughtful touches that blended both their tastes. A bookshelf held her books alongside his, a comfortable rocking chair sat beside the fireplace, and on the table was a vase filled with wildflowers. Most touching of all was the painting hanging on the wall, a small but skillful rendering of Silver Creek Lake in winter, the very spot where their story had begun. "Mrs. Reynolds painted it," Quentin explained, watching her reaction. "From my description, thought you might like a reminder." "Of nearly drowning?" Cordelia asked teasingly. Quentin's arms encircled her from behind, his chin resting lightly on her head. "Of how sometimes the worst moments can lead to the best," he corrected softly. "If you hadn't fallen through that ice, our paths might never have crossed." Cordelia turned in his embrace to face him. "Then I'm grateful for the thin ice," she said. "For everything that brought me here to you." Their kiss deepened, a promise of the night to come and the life they would build together. Spring flowed into summer and summer into fall. Cordelia adapted to life in the cabin with surprising ease. She learned to cook over an open fire, to preserve fruits and vegetables for the winter months, to identify useful herbs and plants. Quentin taught her to shoot, a skill he insisted was necessary for her safety when he was away checking traps, and she proved to have a natural aptitude that impressed even him. In turn, she brought her own influences to their home. She established a small garden, cultivating not only practical vegetables but flowers that brightened their doorstep. She set up a modest lending library in one corner of their sitting room, sharing her books with children from outlying farms who had little access to education. Twice a week, she still helped at the school in town, finding fulfillment in teaching that she had never anticipated. As the anniversary of their first meeting approached, with winter once again tightening its grip on the valley, Cordelia had news of her own to share. She had suspected for several weeks, but wanted to be certain before telling Quentin. They were sitting before the fire one evening in early December, Quentin carving a new chess piece to replace one that had been lost, Cordelia mending one of his shirts. "You ever regret it?" she asked suddenly. Quentin looked up, brow furrowed. "Regret what? Saving me that day, taking on a wife, giving up your solitude." He set down his carving knife, giving her his full attention. "What brings this on?" Cordelia set aside her mending. "Nothing concerning, I assure you. I'm merely curious about your thoughts as things are about to change again." Interest sparked in his eyes. "Change how?" She took a deep breath, a smile spreading across her face. "The cabin might need another addition by summer, a small one for a nursery." Quentin went very still, his expression shifting from confusion to dawning comprehension to wonder in the space of seconds. "Cordelia," he breathed. "Are you saying—" "We're going to have a child," she confirmed, joy bubbling through her words. "In late June, Dr. Miller believes." In an instant, Quentin was kneeling before her chair, his hands cradling her face with infinite tenderness. "A baby," he whispered, as if testing the word. "Our baby." The awe in his voice brought tears to Cordelia's eyes. "Are you pleased?" "Pleased." He laughed, a sound of pure joy she heard too rarely. "Cordelia, there aren't words." He placed a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "A little piece of both of us." "So you don't regret pulling that drowning woman from the lake?" she teased, her own happiness mirroring his. "Best thing I ever did," he said seriously, rising to pull her into his arms. "Every day with you has been a gift I never thought to have. And now this." He shook his head, overcome. "I love you, Cordelia Irwin, more than I'll ever find words to say." "I love you too," she whispered against his chest. "And I've never been more grateful for thin ice." The months passed in a flurry of preparation. Quentin began work on the nursery addition immediately, determined to have it completed well before the baby's arrival. Word of their expected child spread through Pine Valley, bringing a steady stream of visitors bearing gifts, advice, and offers of help. June brought with it wildflowers, warm days, and the increasingly uncomfortable final stages of Cordelia's pregnancy. Dr. Miller visited regularly, assuring them that everything was progressing normally despite Cordelia's slight frame. First babies often come late, he counseled when Cordelia expressed impatience as her due date passed. Try to rest as much as possible in this heat. Quentin rarely left her side during those final weeks, postponing his usual hunting and trapping to remain close to home. His protective instincts, always strong, had intensified with her pregnancy, sometimes to the point where Cordelia had to gently remind him that she wasn't made of glass. The labor began on a warm night in early July, nearly 2 weeks past Dr. Miller's estimated date. Cordelia woke to the first contractions shortly after midnight, rousing Quentin with a calm that belied her inner nervousness. "It's time," she said simply. What followed was 18 hours of the most challenging physical ordeal Cordelia had ever faced. Quentin sent word to town at first light, bringing Dr. Miller and Mrs. Holloway to assist. Through the long hours that followed, Quentin remained a steady presence, holding Cordelia's hand, wiping her brow, murmuring encouragement when her strength flagged. As sunset painted the sky outside their cabin window, Cordelia gave one final push, and their child entered the world with a robust cry that immediately brought tears to both parents' eyes. "A boy," Dr. Miller announced, placing the squalling infant on Cordelia's chest after quickly cleaning him. "A fine, strong boy." Cordelia looked down at the tiny red face, overwhelmed by a love so powerful it took her breath away. When she glanced up at Quentin, she saw the same emotion reflected in his eyes, which shimmered with unashamed tears. "Hello, little one," she whispered to their son. "We've been waiting for you." Quentin's hand gently touched the baby's dark hair, his finger tracing the perfect shell of a tiny ear. "He's perfect," he said, voice rough with emotion, "just like his mother." They named him Daniel Thomas Irwin Daniel for Quentin's fallen brother, Thomas for Cordelia's father. As summer flowed into autumn and autumn into winter, Daniel grew strong and healthy, with his father's blue eyes and his mother's auburn hair. On a clear, cold day in December, exactly 2 years after their first meeting, Quentin took Cordelia and Daniel on a special outing. Bundled against the winter chill, they rode together on Renegade to Silver Creek Lake, now safely frozen solid. Standing at the edge of the ice, Cordelia held Daniel while Quentin unpacked a small picnic hot coffee in a thermos, bread and cheese, and a special treat of preserved summer berries. "Strange to think," Quentin said, gazing out at the frozen expanse. "If you hadn't fallen through right at that spot, if I hadn't been tracking that elk that particular day, then we might never have met," Cordelia finished, smiling down at their son, who was attempting to catch snowflakes on his mittened hands. "And this little miracle wouldn't exist." Quentin wrapped an arm around her shoulders, drawing her and Daniel against his side. "2 years ago, I was a solitary man with little purpose beyond survival. Now I have everything I never knew to want." Cordelia leaned into his embrace, contentment warming her despite the cold air. "And I was a lost woman searching for something I couldn't name. Who would have thought I'd find it in the most unlikely of places beneath the ice of a frozen lake in Montana?" Quentin pressed a kiss to her temple, then bent to lift Daniel into his arms. The little boy laughed with delight, reaching up to pat his father's bearded face with snowy mittens. "To thin ice," Quentin said with a rare, full smile, "and to the beautiful woman who was brave enough to fall through it and into my life." "To the cowboy who was brave enough to pull me out," Cordelia returned, her heart full to overflowing with love for her unlikely family. As the winter sun glinted off the frozen lake where their story had begun, Cordelia knew with absolute certainty that she had found not just a home, but a happiness beyond anything she could have imagined in her previous life. What had begun as a brush with death had led to the most vibrant, meaningful life possible, all because a solitary frontiersman had heard her cry and had the courage to break through the ice.